Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to see you all. My name is Christina Edwards. I am the Clinical Trial Director for the Clinical and Social Research and Development Unit at the National Minority Quality Forum. Today, we are going to be having a discussion on what we're calling the evolving landscape for inclusive research, multi-stakeholder perspective. So for today's panel, we wanted to bring together varying perspectives of advocates, industry, legislators, and so forth to discuss the changes and solutions needed to address inequities, as well as the lack of representation in clinical trials and clinical research for new pharmaceuticals and therapeutics. More so, what changes are needed to generate, document more representative evidence about pharmaceutical interventions, so we know how to safely and effectively they are for everyone. So what I want to do, I'll start with introductions. We'll have a moderated Q&A, and then if time permits, we'll also take some questions for the audience. So I'm honored to introduce our panelists. We'll start with Dr. Hughes, the Chief Medical Officer at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, CMMI. Dr. Hughes.
Thank you. I want to start by thanking you for inviting me to participate in this session today. I also want to commend the National Minority Quality Forum's longstanding leadership and Dr. Puckrin in particular's leadership in this area on this issue of diversity in clinical trials. For those of you that may be newer to the CMS Innovation Center, or CMMI, we were created by the Affordable Care Act in 2010 to support large models. That's what we call our research demonstrations, our equivalent of clinical trials in the CMS space. We were created to test quality and costs in these large-scale models. And we have, since over that time, we have supported more than 50 models. We're currently running 28 models right now. When we did one study, we looked over a 2-year period. We had over 26 million beneficiaries, Medicare, Medicaid beneficiaries in our models, and we were present in all 50 states. We had more than 900,000 provider types, provider groups also participating in our models. So for CMS, the CMS Innovation Center is certainly the lead in many respects in terms of running these large-scale research demonstrations or models, again, as we call it. And in 2020, at the end of the 10-year mark, and in 2021, around the change in the administration, it made sense to take a step back and take a look and say, what did we learn from our first 10 years? What did we learn trying to improve quality and reduce costs for our beneficiaries? And of our many lessons, was especially relevant for today, is we found that in many of our models, equity was not centered. We did not consider or incorporate equity enough, and that manifests itself in a number of different ways. Perhaps most notably for this panel is that many of our models were overwhelmingly white, higher income individuals on Medicare, not Medicaid. In certain areas, they were not well represented. And so it really has forced us to examine our own practices and think about what opportunities we have to ensure that our models are equitably benefiting all of our beneficiaries that we serve, that we're capturing the full diversity of our seniors and those others in our Medicare and Medicaid programs. And so that is led to our new 2030 vision that was announced in October of last year, a health system that achieves equitable outcomes through high quality, affordable, and person-centered care. And we have launched a number of different pillars within areas of focus, one of which squarely focuses on equity. And I think that gets to a number of the challenges that many face in terms of how do we make sure we're bringing in diverse patient populations? How are we working with doctors and other providers who are participating in our models? What types of technical assistance may be needed? What's the recruitment and retention strategy? What does the model itself have to involve so it has relevance to diverse beneficiaries? We are working to address all of these questions. You will continue to hear more and more from us in the days and months ahead. The final note I would say is that Our latest ACO model, ACO Reach, did provide a helpful insight in terms of how we plan to address equity. And in part, we are looking to score applications based in part on the diversity of the participants that would be served through the model. So we are being very intentional, very deliberate, and we intend to be aggressive in the days and months ahead, again, as we work on diversity in our models at CMS. So with that, I'll turn the mic back to you and look forward to questions later.
Next up, we have Dr. Maha Radhakrishnan, Chief Medical Officer at Biogen.
Thank you, Christina. Hello, everyone. Good morning. I have to first of all say it's an honor to be here on this panel, and listening to my fellow members on the panel earlier this morning just brought me to tears. So Dr. Puckren, thank you for inviting me to join this group. And I can tell you this is my first time here at the meeting, but certainly not the last time. You know, for those of you who know me, you know that I also come from a background of, I'm a woman of color. I'm a proud woman of color. This is what my parents instilled in me, that, never give up in life. Impossible does not exist. So I'm really proud here to be representing Biogen. I work for Biogen. I'm the Chief Medical Officer. And here to just give you a little bit of insights into maybe even taking what Dr. Hughes said and talk about the importance of diversity as we look at clinical trials, whether they are randomized controlled studies or whether they are real-world data generation approaches. We always have to keep the needs of the racial and the ethnically diverse patient populations, gender identity, age, socioeconomic status, all of these factors in mind. Randomized controlled studies are designed for a reason, for us to be able to quantify the safety and effectiveness of medications in controlled clinical trial settings so that they get the regulatory approval. But the good news is, even the regulators, obviously CMS, FDA, and others, are looking at diversity as one of the critical parameters of how to design even randomized clinical studies. At Biogen, we take this very seriously. We hold ourselves accountable. Since the year 2020, we have specialized team members who are really focused on how do we implement diversity, equity, and health and diversity in our clinical studies. So from the randomized clinical trial aspect and taking it to the real world, we put a lot of attention and focus in really understanding how to generalize the data coming from the clinical studies. How do you account for the comorbid conditions? How do you account for the racial and ethnically diverse patient populations who do not have access to care, who are in locations that are not close to the clinical trial sites, who do not have access to equitable medicines? So our focus as a pioneer in neuroscience at Biogen, we are focused on neuroscience, we're focused on specialized immunology, but at the same time, we're also focused on providing sustainable access through our biosimilars pipeline. And not to forget, we did hear this morning that, for example, areas like mental health knows no race, knows no color, knows no age. So how could we also integrate digital technology into really bringing forward aspects of helping humans understand that they need to seek out care, they need to reach out for help? So real-world evidence generation is a lot of what I focus on, and I had the honor recently of co-authoring a white paper with Dr. Puckren here, talking about the importance of real-world data, talking about the importance of generating data that is actually meaningful to the patients, to their families, to their caregivers. And we're doing a lot of work in partnership with organizations like the NMQF, the HEAL Collaborative, where we are actually looking at the Medicare and Medicaid beneficiaries through heat maps, a tool called Index, Clinical Trial Index, where we're able to really geolocate patients where they are located and pair them up with clinical trial sites. So whether it be Alzheimer's disease, whether it be lupus, where we have a lot of focus on, whether it be major depression. So yes, we are going into psychiatry, and whether it be Parkinson's, ALS, or other areas, multiple sclerosis for one. So as we go through the panel, I'll be very happy to take questions from each and every one of you, and looking forward to a very interesting session. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you. Joining us virtually, we have Kim Folks, the Global Head of DEI in Clinical Trials and Novartis.
Hi, can you hear me? Just want to make sure you guys can hear me there.
Yes.
Wonderful, great. Well, thank you for having me. As my other colleagues have said, it's great to be invited to be here and talk about what I'm passionate about, which is including diverse patients and underrepresented patients in our clinical trials. And I'm going to speak a bit from maybe the broader pharma view and consortia view on this topic. So underrepresentation and lack of diversity in clinical trials for both patients and investigators and physicians is an important issue that we must address so that we reduce health disparities. And this involves creating more trust. And this means involving and educating communities. And as part of the pharma consortia, we're looking at how we can support more community clinical trial infrastructure. How do we stay embedded in the communities, not just even for clinical trial opportunities, but more health awareness, health education? How can we help solve social determinants of health in these communities? Really understanding their needs and incorporating them into our protocols when we can, and certainly when we go to market as well. And as part of the pharma consortium, they're beginning to test through a learning phase how we can create a community-based research network, leveraging multiple types of partners, including site partners, but also digital partners, and working together to understand how they can drive more reciprocal engagement for the long term. And so we're not only looking to expand research capacity in those communities, but also our understanding for how best to serve the communities. And with that, I can turn it over to the next participant, if you'd like.
Thank you. Next up, we have on the stage Mark Fleury, Policy Principal at ACS-CAN.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody, and thanks to NMQF for the opportunity to speak today. I've been asked to spend a few minutes to talk a little bit about the legislative and regulatory landscape around clinical trial diversity, a really important issue. And when we think about policies to try and promote diversity in clinical trial participation, there are a variety of sticks and carrots that we can use to try to drive towards this goal. And we see some of these proposals that address specifically identified barriers, and others are more about setting expectations and goals and leaving it up to the trial sponsors to figure out the specific barriers and interventions. I want to talk first about a few examples of those specific policies around known barriers. And one is a piece of legislation that was actually passed in late 2020 called the Clinical Treatment Act. And what this piece of legislation did was to require all Medicaid plans throughout the United States to cover routine care costs in clinical trials. While most insurance plans throughout the United States, Medicare, private insurance, cover routine care costs in trials, and these are the costs that you would have to pay for whether you're in the trial or not, because we know sponsors pay for all the experimental portions. But importantly, there were quite a few states whose Medicaid plans still essentially barred their participants from participating in clinical trials. So you had a whole swath of folks who sort of by definition were lower income. And as we know, Medicaid participants tend to be more demographically diverse and traditionally underrepresented in clinical trials. And so for this swath of people, they couldn't enroll if they wanted to because basically none of their costs would be covered. So this piece of legislation required all plans in the United States to cover that. And so it went into effect earlier this year. And this is a great example of identifying a very specific barrier that was standing in the way. Another piece of legislation that has not yet been passed, but that ACS-CAN has been working on quite a bit lately is called the Diverse Trials Act. And it's really driven by a key statistic that we find individuals who come from families who make less than $50,000 a year, about 30% less likely to participate in a clinical trial. And this is even if they have good insurance. And you might ask, well, if their medical costs are covered, why wouldn't they participate? And why would there be this income sensitivity? Well, anybody who's ever gone to a major medical center and had to pay $20, $30 for parking at the parking garage knows that the cost to get healthcare is not just copays and deductibles, right? There's transportation, there's gas, there's parking, there's food. And if you're an hourly worker, it's likely you're going to be missing out on some of the income you would have been making otherwise. Now, many sponsors do help out, providing some of these non-medical or ancillary costs, but some don't. And the reason why is we found that there are some statutory provisions that could be interpreted to perhaps prevent this, the anti-kickback statute and civil monetary penalties. And so we know some sponsors are just really nervous about doing that. So the Diverse Trials Act would create a clear, bright, safe harbor to allow sponsors to support their patients in that. But it also has provisions that try and reduce the need to even come into sites for care altogether by decentralizing clinical trials, allowing them to do some of their visits, for example, from their home. And it calls on FDA to create some guidance, but also creates a safe harbor so that those without the right technology, those can be provided as well. Kind of moving to other types of policies that we have seen, there is a piece of legislation called the DEPICT Act from Representative Ashew. And this really is about holding sponsors to create plans to try and develop goals for diverse participation and to share those and be held accountable for that. Now, in a quite timely move, about 2 weeks ago, FDA just released some draft guidance about the same issue. How to communicate with the FDA plans to create a diverse clinical trial pool. And it's both about the guidance kind of talks about the communications process with FDA, but it also provides some very specific recommendations. And among those is suggesting that sponsors should help patients with those non-medical costs. So again, just reiterating the importance of that. But the last thing I'd mention about this guidance, and something I would say overall about diverse clinical trial participation, is just because you manage to get a diverse pool of patients into your clinical trial doesn't mean you can necessarily ascertain whether different groups have different outcomes. That really has to be baked into the scientific protocol. You have to plan on those analyses. So it's not enough just to get the people in the door. You also have to have a plan for what you're going to do with those data that you collect. So that was a really quick overview of some of the policy landscape. And again, look forward to questions during the Q&A session.
Our next panelist, we have Lloryn Hubbard, the Patient Diversity Clinical Research at PPD, part of Thermo Fisher Scientific. I'll give a bit of a prelude to Lloryn. So Lloryn with PPD is partnering on what NMQF's newest approach to diversity, specifically working with community clinicians. And what they'll be doing is training these clinicians to be investigators, their staff as well to be research personnel. And our idea is that to increase diversity, we want to go into the community. We want to go where the diverse populations are underrepresented and so forth. And Lloryn and PPD were helping us achieve that.
Thank you, Christina. Yeah, so Lloryn Hubbard from PPD, as mentioned, and thank you for having me on the panel, and also thank you for including a CRO in this conversation. We do a lot of the lifting of some of the sponsors, but we often aren't a part of these kind of talks, so I appreciate you inviting me. To Christina's point, we are working with NMQF, sponsoring or helping them with their site alliance through our initiative called Site Coach. So when I started at PPD, I realized that we're very aware of the barriers that are impacting these patient populations. What are we, as a CRO, going to do to, like, what actions are we going to take? So I went through what PPD already offered. And one of the things they offered was Site Coach, which I had not heard of. And so what it is really a 13-hour in-depth training to increase your best practices for clinical research as a naive site. I realize that this is a great opportunity for us to not only educate naive sites, but sites that don't typically see clinical trials, sites that see the patient populations that we are looking for as far as underrepresented and underserved, but don't have the tools, resources, aren't even aware of the clinical trials that are available to them. So in working with NMQF and bringing that together, that's what we're really gonna help them with, is to help train these sites that don't typically see clinical trials, but do see the patient populations that need to be represented. At PPD, you know, I applaud PPD for taking this initiative, for hiring myself and my team to actually be dedicated to patient diversity, making sure that we are making it a priority as a business. So part of my remit and part of my strategy is to really think through our drug development process and how we can embed innovative solutions. It used to be practical solutions. We realized practical really isn't working in this space. We need to be really innovative with how we are embedding different solutions, different mindset shifts, around patient diversity, how we see these patients, how we approach these patients, and how we ensure that the community building continues beyond the study. So happy to be here, happy for the discussion. Thanks, Christina.
Next up, we have Salvo Aleshi, Chief Scientist and Strategy Officer, beyond Celiac.
Thanks, Christina, and good morning, everyone. It's truly a pleasure to be here and in person. This is one of my favorite meetings. I've been here before, and particularly on a panel discussing clinical trial diversity, which is a topic close to my heart, where I had the opportunity, privilege, and pleasure to work with the NMQF and Gary in particular over the last decade. Today, as you heard from Christina, I'm here in my role of Chief Science Officer of an organization called Beyond Celiac. Beyond Celiac is the leading patient advocacy organization, science-driven, focused on accelerating development treatment of a cure for celiac disease. And what a perfect example to talk about the importance of diversity, not just in clinical trial, but I would just say in the diagnosis of the disease. I share a passion for data with Gary, and I mentioned a few data here, but perhaps at the end also give a personal story. A pretty comprehensive systematic review, I think it's 2018, that looked at more than 275 patients with diagnosed celiac between 1991 and I think 2016 worldwide, actually showed that the actual prevalence of biopsy diagnosed celiac is the same in the North America and Africa, 0.5%. I can tell you that's such a huge underestimate, and that's why I say biopsy diagnosed celiac. But it's true, in all fairness, that as you go across the world, in the United States and so on, there are differences in terms of the prevalence of the disease, including some difference in terms of racial and ethnicity. The reality is, the assumption is certain populations are less prone to get the disease, but it has never been proven. It's never been proven, and there can be other reasons for that, as I'm gonna mention in a moment. Now, having said that, most key opinion leaders, again, recognize that this is a disease that affects you independent of what your race, socioeconomic status is. And the guidelines, the clinical guidelines actually demand that if you present with symptoms of celiac, you need to be properly diagnosed independent of what your background is. But that's not the reality that we are facing. And again, citing a couple of papers, published work here as well, to give the dimension of the issue. An analysis, actually, I think this was a paper in 2012, I believe, that looked about 13,000 people. This was in the United States. People presented with symptoms of celiac, so anemia, chronic diarrhea, iron deficiency. That paper showed that if you were Black, particularly if you were a Black male, your likelihood of undergoing a biopsy to confirm the diagnosis was almost half. I think it was 28% overall in the Black population versus 44%, which is still not ideal in the white population. I think things get worse, if you allow me, because there is even a more recent paper, I think 2021, in Digestive Disease and Sciences. This was an analysis looking at payer data and so on. which show that if you are actually a Black American and/or are you on Medicare and Medicaid plans, not on private plans, your chances of having a proper follow-up for celiac disease are 90%. You heard me, 90% less than if you are on a private insurance plan. So I'm not exaggerating here. I'm just kind of tend to be emphatic because of my passion, but these are numbers. That's why I cite numbers. And now kind of linking this, why this is important for clinical trials. Celiac disease, it's really an orphan disease in a way, because the only treatment we have is a strict gluten-free diet, which is impossible to keep up, really, and often doesn't resolve your condition. And by the way, I speak not just at the scientific level. I have 2 kids with celiac disease, so I've seen this through their eyes as my family and patient with celiac disease. Now, the good news is that finally we saw a little bit of a renaissance in this space, with pretty much most of the major pharmaceutical company and small as well investing in this area, which is great. The problem is that if you don't diagnose the patient, and especially, patient from undeserved community, you're not going to have patients that go into clinical trials. That means delays. That means clinical trials that don't reflect the actual real picture of the disease. And eventually, that would mean probably restricted access to medicine later on and so on. So none of this is good. Personally, at Beyond Celiac, we took this to our heart. We are the first, I guess, organization that is really making this visible more publicly. And I'm particularly proud of a partnership that we signed with the National Minority Equality Forum to develop a celiac index that would allow us to map the disease across the United States. And we are already seeing some very interesting data in terms of the divergence of the demographic, even between certain parts of the United States, the North, the Midwest, where some of the center of excellence are, and the South, where we think there is a lot of missed diagnosis and misdiagnosis. In fact, we have an abstract that was submitted, accepted at the DDW meeting. So hopefully, that's at the end of May, we can make this even more visible. So that's as much I would like to say now, and I look forward to the conversation. I also think we should be excited though here. I kind of presented the dark side because I truly believe, having worked again with Gary and others for 10 years, this is an inflection point in this space with a lot of moving parts, from changes being implemented in clinical trial to policy, the FDA, the NIH. I think we should really kind of ride the wave here, because I don't think we're going to get another opportunity.
Okay, thank you, Salvo. Also, I want to point out we have Jamie Buer in the audience from the FDA, and following the panel, if any of you have questions, you can speak with her. All right, so we'll move on to the Q&A. So we want to start with, we want to level set the baseline. How do our panelists define diversity? That'll mean different things for different people. Diversity is a prism depending on the angle you're looking at. So we want to see what it means for our various stakeholders we have here. We will start with Dr. Hughes. How does CMMI define diversity?
So I would say that CMS generally focuses in terms of how do we define equity. Not too long ago, our administrator, Chiquita Brooks-LaSure, brought many of us together, and we came to consensus on a definition of health equity that, in so many words, is that every individual has a fair and just opportunity to attain the highest level of health possible, regardless of the race and ethnicity, disability, where they live, sexual orientation, gender identity, preferred language, and any other factor that impedes access and quality of care. And so, as you will see increasingly in our materials from CMS, that is, we anchor back to that definition, which of course fully aligns with the administration's broader definition. I would also have to note that just Friday, CMS released its health equity principles and additional materials on the website. And so I certainly encourage any of you who have interest to check those out. And and let us know your reaction, and also help us think about how that can translate better to our programs and policies.
Maha?
Great. I'll just build on Dr. Hughes in terms of, the other aspects that I consider when you look at diversity is also, when you look at medications being tested as part of clinical studies, you have to consider not just the pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic aspects, but you also need to be looking at pharmacogenomics, because there are patient populations that could be predisposed to certain conditions that we may or may not be aware of. Need to consider comorbid conditions, which very often are not factored in when you test them under controlled clinical studies. And CONMEDs, what other medications are they taking? But I think also another very important consideration every time we start to look at meaningfully generating data is the epidemiology of the illness we're talking about. So I don't think the definition of diversity differs, but it's just how much we try to look into it to enrich it so it becomes applicable to the broad, diverse, general populations out there.
Mark, so why do you think that common understanding is needed?
Yeah, I think, when we think about diversity, obviously, it's things like your demographics, your income, something, especially in oncology, it's where you live, right? And you have great access often if you're in an urban area. Not all parts of urban areas have great access, but rural areas especially often don't have the specialists there, and folks have to go a long ways to be enrolled in clinical trials. So we need to think about all dimensions when we think about equity or diversity in our clinical trials. One thing that I would maybe mention, and this is especially true when we talk about sort of representativeness in drug development, it may be different in different disease areas, but I know in oncology, probably about 2/3 of the data that are used to approve new cancer drugs come from outside of the US. So that's an important question when we think about diversity. We often think about it, with a very domestic US-centric view, but we know these drugs are being used throughout the world, and in many cases, a lot of the research is being done there. So when we think about diversity and how they reflect the people who are going to ultimately use the drug, I think we need to really open the aperture and fully understand that as we think about, again, analyzing how differences may occur. Because I think diversity is there really for two reasons. One is social justice. It's an equity issue. Everybody should have equal access to research. But then there's the scientific part. Does the drug work differently, or the treatment work differently for different groups? So again, really need to think of this in the most expansive way possible.
Lloryn, from the CRO perspective.
Yeah, so from the CRO perspective, we really had to level set what diversity meant. And so really we got to the basis of it. It's traits and characteristics that make everyone unique, right? And if you think about diversity that way, then you can think outside of the box of just race and ethnicity, which is generally what we perceive diversity as, especially as a CRO when we're trying to serve the client, right? And so just being able to level set was really helpful at PPD. And so now we can think outside of the box. We can think about military and vets. We can think about physically disabled. We can think about LGBTQIA. We can think about age differently. We can think about the youth, adolescents, et cetera, especially just from the panel before us, like how can we not think about them that way now? So that's really how we are grasping diversity. And of course, we acknowledge the underserved and underrepresented patient populations that we need to see in our trials. But that is also layered, right? There's intersectionality within diversity. There's dimensions to each patient. So we want to make sure that we're aware of that as well.
Hi, Kim.
Hi.
Hi.
So yeah, I was just going to add, I agree with everything that my colleagues have said. And I think just to add on to the point of, this is not just a US issue. I am the global head for diversity and inclusion in clinical trials at Novartis. And as we have started to expand into other countries, it's been interesting because some of the initial conversations with some of my colleagues in those countries are, well, we don't have a lot of people with different ethnic backgrounds or racial backgrounds. And then I start the conversation. I say, well, do you have any underserved populations in your country? And every time I get a yes on that. So that starts to become the basis, and then we start to talk about those underserved populations and how we can reach out to them. And so that was the only other thing I just wanted to add. Thank you.
Salvo from the patient.
Yeah, very briefly, because I guess everything has been said. I would just say maybe just add a different spin to this from the patient advocacy organization. For me, diversity speaks to a very basic principle of inclusiveness. So I think that's why we see Beyond Celiac. I cite, of course, the highlights of our efforts, but we really put this at the center. We have, within a small organization, are developing actually a diversity and inclusion strategy. Actually, Erin Miller in the audience is leading that, so hopefully you can ask her more about it. So to me, that's the basic concept, inclusiveness. I definitely echo what Maha said. This is both a scientific and ethical issue. In fact, it's both, and both are important. Maybe as we speak particularly about clinical trial, one additional element I want to think about it, that inclusiveness, of course, is important from the patient perspective, but the relation between patient and physicians is very, very important. So I think that diversity has to be reflected actually in the healthcare, overall healthcare professionals, all the way from nurses, nurse practitioner, physician, particularly those that have a strong voice. I can't think of too many key opinion leaders in the celiac field that belong to a more diverse group of people. So that's probably as much as I would add.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to pivot a little bit and piggyback a little bit off what Maha mentioned. We also see a lack of representation in the data. So we want to talk a little bit, how do RCTs and real world data complement each other when building representative evidence for trials and so forth, safety, efficacy, and the therapeutic agents that are in development.
Thank you. So as I said earlier, randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, are indeed the gold standard in terms of generating evidence that ultimately lead to product approval so that they could be used in the wider clinical practice. But what behooves us, people who are part of the industry that are generating data, working with the worldwide patient communities, is to really think about how do you complement that in terms of continuing the evidence generation? How do you take that data to broader communities and to be able to generalize it so the safety and effectiveness of medications can truly be applicable to a broad base of patients, right? So this is where I think the importance of real-world evidence comes in, the importance of really trying to understand, not just, as my colleagues have said, the scientific nuances, the underpinnings of the basic pathophysiology of conditions, how they manifest, the severity of illness, the duration of illness, the symptomatology, they all differ. No disease is uniform across patients, we know that. And we need to be able to really quantify that and be able to not just do studies for the sake of studies. We need to be able to publish that evidence. There are team members in my organization. Just last year alone, we did close to 30 publications looking at health equity, diversity and inclusion in patients in the real world. We are looking at registries, because when you look at real world evidence, registries form a very crucial part of it. Electronic health records form a key part of it, and so do claims. I think that the claims database is one of the richest repositories of information that's out there, and we need to mine the medical claims, the lab claims, the hospitalizations, and the utilization criteria to really understand, are there differences and nuances, and be able to publish that data. And lastly, I would say real-world evidence generation is, I think my colleagues on this panel, but also on the earlier panel mentioned, it's not about evidence-based practice, but it's about practice based on the evidence you get. So how do you take the data you get and make it meaningful to patients, make it meaningful to their caregivers and family members? So we have been working with the NMQF as part of this and launched something we called as CTLC, or the Clinical Trial Learning Communities. We were working with the clinical trial sites, the clinical treatment team members, as well as advocacy organizations to really talk about in a virtual community what is needed to move the needle from a randomized controlled study to data that will be meaningful to the real world.
Dr. Hughes, how do you and CMMI utilize real-world data?
Yeah, that was very helpful. It was also very helpful to hear your comments. I think for CMS, much of the evidence that we generate would be considered real-world evidence if I had my manufacturer's hat on. We are very often looking through our claims as well as other sources of data to understand cost and quality, but some of that certainly would include what is the impact on hospitalizations? Are we able to drive down the rate? What about emergency department visits? And then also increasingly, and I'd be curious in terms of whether this is an area we're trying to look at patient experience and look at PROMs and PREMs and all of that as well. And so increasingly trying to be able to pair the two, being very clearly focused on the beneficiary perspective and their experience, as well as what we're able to see clinically in terms of hospitalizations and visits and whatnot. And so it's kind of an interesting, could be an interesting intersection of worlds in terms of what we often consider primary endpoints would be real world impact for you.
Thank you. So Mark, you mentioned earlier a couple of the new bills that are in development, the Clinical Treatment Act and so forth. But Salvo, I want you to touch on a little bit. Beyond Celiac recently endorsed the Clinical Trial Diversity Act. Can you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, of course, of course. Yeah, actually, I'm very glad that we endorsed the Clinical Trial Diversity Act, and kudos to Congresswoman Robin Kelly for trying to push that through the floor. You know, there are, so maybe just for those that are less familiar with the act, so this is pretty much trying to provide a framework for the NIH in a very collaborative way to work with sponsors to make sure that diversity goals, let's call it, milestones are developed and met. Nothing new. I must say I have the privilege to work at the NIH in the intramural program for about a decade. And actually the diversity of the NIH is one of the things that will attract me the most, not just in terms of the people working there from so many countries, but the policy. So this really builds on current policy of the intramural program, try to expand extramurally. I think one element that we found at Beyond Celiac particularly attractive is that the approach is scientific. So it's not a cookie cutter approach where, okay, we need to have X%, X quota of African American, Latino, and so on. And I know in the past there were discussions like this, but it really has pretty much allowed the NIH to work with sponsors to define this metric based on the disease that is being investigated, based on its actual prevalence. So that's very important. It's a both scientific and ethical approach. And I think it's important because the basic principle of the act, which I think is one that I fully embrace, is that you want to make sure that clinical trial include people that are impacted the most. There is actually an analysis, again, studying number, I'm sorry, I'm studying all these numbers, but there is an analysis done by the NIH actually that show that, you know, while, you know, Black Americans have an increased risk of 75% of developing prostate cancer and more than twofold higher risk of mortality from it. Only 8% of Black America were included in NIH-sponsored clinical trial in 2018. So I think that was a key driver. Other aspect of the bills, you know, they would allow the NIH to put in place restrictions that are still there in terms of extending grants or even funding, you know, cutting resources if these goals are not met by the sponsor. But there is another aspect, again, for us from a patient advocacy organization we like a lot, which is push sponsor to come up with alternate way to reduce complexity of clinical trial. For example, follow-up visits, right? Doing that in weekends, maybe doing it now through Zoom or whatever platform, which is very important, particularly, you know, if you are in a certain community, you are a busy single mom, no matter what your color is, and you have to choose between taking care of your kids and school and so on and doing in a clinical trials. I think your priority are probably shift towards family, I would hope, right? And then the last aspect of the bill has to do more with building awareness across federal agency about the importance of driving diversity in clinical trials. So there is an angle that is more of a campaign. So we only felt that all of this fits, first of all, with our goal. They are very patient-centric and science-centric, and that's why we endorse the bill.
Kim, from the industry's perspective, what are the considerations for drug development with the evolving legislation?
Yeah, so I think with the legislation coming, what we need to do in industry is really look at how we've been creating our access plans. Even before this, we wanted to broaden access to our medicines across the globe. However, now I see the need for us to really, at the time of even target patient profile, really defining those populations and understanding the disease prevalence for the markets and parts of the world that we want to go to, and embedding that information early. My understanding, being in this space full time now for a couple of years, is that most teams don't even know the disease prevalence. So they don't know there's any gaps. And so when you don't know this information, you can't plan for or make plans to overcome those gaps or how you're going to fill the gaps. And so all the way, again, from creating the target patient profile, understanding those patient journeys of each of those segments of the population, including when and how long we are delayed or they are delayed to diagnosis, because I think that starts to illuminate one of the reasons why pharma would really want to understand these differences in the population, as well as that then it starts to feed your strategies all the way through the development cycle.
Thank you. And for Dr. Hughes, we want to know, how does CMS help states enable Medicaid beneficiaries to participate in clinical research?
Sure. I mean, certainly we have had our eye on that bill when it passed. And in December, my colleagues in the Medicaid Center, they released guidance to help states and investigators and other stakeholders understand what, to the point is, what is considered routine cost of care, how they should be covered, what's the definition of a clinical trial, what do states need to do in terms of developing state plan amendments or SPAs, just really trying to help bridge the bill passing, the legislation passing, into what does this mean for states and for those that are seeking coverage through clinical trials. What's been interesting for us is that CMS and the National Institutes of Health, they partnered together as part of what we call the Joint Leadership Council, I believe. JLC is the acronym. And through that process, through that communication, we're able to hear, by way of NIH, what they're hearing in the field from some of their investigators. They're saying, okay, we know that it's covered, but these are some of the additional barriers that we're encountering. This may be an area that would be helpful for us if we were able to get additional guidance, not even in the formal sense, or just feedback or information from CMS in terms of what's covering once you start to go several levels deeper. And through that, hearing that, particularly in this, thinking in the sickle cell disease context as one example, that hearing even still that there's gray areas or areas still of confusion where it would be helpful for additional discussion, certainly. So that's something that CMS is quite focused on, and again, may be an area where you hear more from us in the days ahead.
Okay, so this has been an ongoing process. It's been a long time coming, and it's still going to continue to be an ongoing process. But how can we learn from what's taken place thus far, and how can we speed it up? People are impatient. They want to know, how do we implement what is currently going on? How can we move the pedestal further along? Dr. Maha, What lessons have we learned from studies thus far, and what is Biogen doing to address?
So this is a very, very important question, something I work very closely on with my colleagues in the company in terms of really understanding how have we fared so far in our clinical studies. And I will be very honest, I'll tell you, as an industry, we've not been doing a good job, right? We have been in the single digits in terms of recruiting patients from diverse backgrounds into clinical studies. So with that in mind, we have right now, as part of our overarching corporate scorecard from the year 2020, where we have actual goals. Some members of my panel mentioned diversity goals. So we do have that. So for example, for our soon to enroll, I would say, ENVISION study in Alzheimer's disease, which is a post-marketing requirement. It's a controlled confirmatory study. We have upped our diversity goals to up to 18% of patients, because what we found out was in our clinical studies, we reached 2 to 3% of diverse patient populations. So we have made a conscious effort working with the authorities to ensure that we are going to capture that. And this applies not just to Alzheimer's, it's a case for lupus as well. We are studying 2 programs in systemic and cutaneous lupus. So we have intentionally worked with the likes of the Boston Medical Center and other institutions across the world to really say, my colleague Kim on the call mentioned a prevalence. Yes, incidence, prevalence, epidemiology matters. What outcomes are important to patients? And then working with the regulators and authorities to say, do we need to be looking at different ways to capture data? Patient-reported outcomes, as Dr. Hughes mentioned. So we are learning each and every day. We learn from within our organization, we learn from others, we rely on scientific publications and congresses, but more importantly, what I want to stress is we have formed what we call as the Community Advisory Board, which is a group of patients and patient advocates who are giving us real-time feedback in terms of content, messaging, outcomes that are going to be meaningful to them, and what truly matters to them. We bring that back to another group of scientific experts we engage with and say, this is what the patients need. How do we make that happen? So I feel that we are on the right journey, but Biogen alone cannot do this. We need the help of everyone in this audience and more to work on this together.
Thank you. Lloryn, speaking to the Alliance for Representative Clinical Trials and Site Coach and what NMQF is doing, how can training minority-serving clinicians and investigators fundamentally improve infrastructure for clinical research in the community?
Yeah, well, like Salvo said, like we need to really recognize that the patient populations that we want to see, they see physicians that look like them. So oftentimes PIs don't look like the patient populations we want to see in our studies. So how are we going about, as an industry, finding these physicians of color? We know they're there. We know they exist. We know that they see these patients. We continue to go to the same sites. We recognize in clinical trials that we want fast enrolling sites. We want high performing sites. And we continue to go to those same sites over and over again, regardless of the patient population that they provide, which is generally 90 to 98% white Caucasian patients. So we need to really diversify the sites that we go to. We need to diversify the physicians that we approach as KOLs. When we think about the KOLs that sit on our boards for our different protocols, we need to make sure that that is also a diverse board, so that we can ensure that they are providing the information to ensure that the patients that they see are also represented in the protocols and the studies that we're doing. So it definitely plays a major role in our research. What PPD is doing in collaboration with NMQF is a step in the right direction. We also are taking steps to really comb through our databases of sites. PPD has a wealth of sites that we work with. Do many of those physicians look like the patient populations we want to see? So we're working on that internally to ensure that we are also not adding to the problem when you come to us and you're trying to use us to help you with your site support or your site selection. We're using data-driven feasibility to make sure that we're looking at the right target areas, and also not only those sites in that target areas, but community health centers in those target areas, places where we know the patients are being seen, even if they don't have clinical trial experience, can we provide the resources that they need to get ready for clinical trials? Can we train them with site coach? Can we provide more study coordinators, or can we provide community outreach support? This is kind of an innovative way we're thinking now. We realize just going to the same sites and not providing them with any resources isn't helping. Even if you look at sites that do perform well, they don't have the time or the resources to go into the community. They don't have the ability to really find these new patients. So how are we supporting them in that as well? So looking forward really to working with NMQF more to get not only these sites on board and within the PPD system so that we can make sure they're seeing studies, because the other thing that we do as an industry is we recognize there's a need for a specific patient population. We go find these sites, we do the study, and then we leave. We don't continue to support these sites. So what we're trying to do is make sure that they're well supported and that they continue to get studies, they continue to receive the support that they need so that we can establish a relationship and community.
Thank you. Mark, can you quickly touch on ACS-CAN's collaborative efforts to remove barriers of participation in oncology trials?
Sure, thanks for the question. Yeah, so we really around then President Obama's Cancer Moonshot Challenge to double the rate of research progress, we formed a sort of a loose community of advocates, stakeholders, to really take a deep dive and look at what some of those barriers were that were keeping patients out of cancer clinical trials specifically, but a lot of the lessons go beyond cancer. And we issued a report and made recommendations. And in DC, we're a town where everybody puts out reports and recommendations, and then they often just gather dust on the shelf. We decided we didn't want to just throw out recommendations and hope somebody would do something about it. We continued to hold that group together and meet regularly and really roll up our sleeves and try and address some of those. And some of that has been advocacy that I mentioned around some of these legislative priorities, some a little bit more programmatic. Right now, for example, we're developing a free open source clinical trial screening tools that small sites could use free of cost. As we heard before, clinical trial participation and access is really about where you go to be seen. And large academic sites offer a wealth of trials. Small community sites or safety net hospitals sometimes offer very few or no trials at all, even though there may be the perfect trial for you 3 blocks down the road or 3 miles. And so what we're trying to do with this program is really take a look beyond just the institution to help find trials. So really just sort of a smorgasbord of activities, because there's no one silver bullet in this area, really. You need to solve multiple problems at once. It's access, it's financial resources, it's knowledge, all these things at the same time. So that's what we're trying to do together with other partners in this space.
Thank you. I don't see anyone at the mic. Does anyone have a question? Oh, yes. Hello.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. My name is Dr. Mani Keita Fakeye. I'm here representing Deloitte as their Health Equity Research Manager, also faculty at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I really appreciate the insights that you all provided. As a fellow scientist, this really resonates with me. In thinking through kind of more root issues around this, I'm curious about your perspective on building and repairing trust. We've talked a lot about the goal and the outcome of diversifying clinical trials, but there is a root issue of trust here that needs to be repaired and built on. And I'm curious about the process that you engage in to accomplish that.
Any takers?
Maybe I'll start. It's a fantastic question. I think you're absolutely spot on, is that the basis of mistrust then propagates the stigma, propagates the misperception, and propagates the fear of enrolling in clinical studies. which is why I think it's very important that we are really focused on community outreach, whether it be through faith-based collaborative organizations like HEAL. You will hear Howard Mosby speak about it in our next panel, or even designing specific educational sessions, whether it be live or virtual now, focused on cultural competencies, focused on the need to make people and communities aware that they need to seek out help in case they are not feeling well, that clinical studies are here to help them, that real-world data generation will help really characterize the meaningfulness of medications for their specific ethnic background or diverse backgrounds. So you are spot on that trust is something we all need to be talking about. The stigma is something we all need to strive to improve, and it's not going to happen overnight, but it is going to take a collective effort of training and reinforcing the need to seek help and get treated.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Camille Pope, and I'm here representing Acclinate. And we're an organization that is trying to build from the ground up, boots on the ground, community member engagement, so that folks are informed about clinical trials, building that trust in communities so that when an opportunity for clinical trials comes their way, they are ready to consider it. And on the flip side, we like to partner with pharmaceutical companies and CROs in helping to identify where those patients are once they've been educated around the trial process. And I think it's really important to bring those community healthcare providers into the conversation. So I'm really excited to hear about what NMQF and PPD are doing. I'm wondering if there are specific cities or areas within the US that you're focusing the site coach program on. And then also for Kim on the screen, wanted to hear more about the community-based research network that is being built. I guess this is with pharma, or is it just Novartis by itself?
Sure. So I can talk about a little bit as far as the communities that we are going into. As Dr. Parker mentioned earlier, we have worked with many FQHCs, so we have been starting there. But we also, NMQF has the ability to map and see where there is prevalence of certain diseases. So we're also working with industry sponsors. So depending on where that avenue takes us, we're able to get a deep dive into where the help is needed. So we will be starting there. And Kim?
Yeah, in terms of the pharma consortia, no, it's not a Novartis only effort. I mean, I think there's up to 30, if not a few more than 30 companies involved in the pharma consortia effort, which will be selecting. First, there'll be a learning phase for about 18 to 24 months. So it'll be a smaller effort just as we learn how to do this work with multiple partners. And so some sites are being selected and worked with now to outline the operating model and how the network would engage with the pharmaceutical partners in terms of placing their trials, getting feedback on their trials. So it's being worked on now, and as that starts to roll out, I know that pharma will be communicating further through their organizations as well as to the broader public.
If I could just add
So I'd
one
like
more thing about, I just wanted to add one more thing about Site Coach. It is available to all sponsors that we work with. And so sometimes it is organized with the sponsor and where their study is occurring. So it can be really specific based on the indication and the population that we identify needs support, and it could be used broadly. So it really is a training for all aspects of the clinical development process. Sorry, I just wanted to add that.
No problem. So I'd like to thank our esteemed panelists, thank the audience. Many of these discussions that you've heard will be discussed throughout various forums throughout the summit. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.